now.
That's great. Except there's a 20-second lag, you say?
Yeah. But we're in the before the lag part.
We're in the zone.
We're lagging.
Great. And I don't see that volume button on my.
Now.
That's great. Except there's a 20-second lag.
Oh,
except there's a 20-second lag, you said?
See if you can mute it.
Better mute it.
I got it.
Yay, I got it too.
So I'm about to mute myself, and then I'm going to disappear from the screen pretty shortly.
This is so exciting.
Yeah.
Have another live event on YouTube for NonClave. Such an exciting time. So great to see all the people chatting, saying hello on the.
My goodness, I should look at that.
Yeah. I think everybody's finding their link pretty easily. I haven't received any emails panicking, or maybe I should check. Yeah.
Well, I think that everybody's sorting it out. I only had one phone call today with anything that wasn't related to.
I think we're getting the swing of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, right at the last moment.
No, I think even all through the week, there's a lot of information.
Boy, there's a lot of information.
Whew, my head hurts.
No, I think everybody's been such a champ to try to find their emails and find their classes, all the events.
Yeah. Whew. So I've certainly had a good week.
Yeah, I have too.
It's been so interesting.
Yeah. It's been very fun.
Yeah, I think I'm getting used to the medium now. And I guess because this is the fun part. It's when you have meetings on Zoom that it's stressful. But that concert last night was just wonderful. I mean, I was able to make dinner and watch.
That's pretty nice.
Yeah. Great. So I guess it's just a little bit after 8. So I'm just going to make some NonClave announcements and welcome everybody to the NonClave lecture and to the VDGSA YouTube channel. And by the way, everybody, you can subscribe, and then when we put new stuff up, you'll see it there. I have the feeling there's going to be a big future for the VDGSA YouTube channel. So I hope you've all had a good week if you're at NonClave. And as we come to the end of our first ever NonClave, just want to say thank you to everybody who's been doing such a great job helping out and enjoying themselves. And we have a great lecture tonight, and I'm going to turn it over to Roz to introduce Patricia Ann Neely. Take it away, Roz.
Great. Thanks, Risa. And thanks, Pat, so much for giving this lecture for us. I'm going to tell everybody now a little bit about Pat. Pat's first encounter with early music was through a recording that she received as a Christmas gift from a family for whom she babysat. And that recording was David Monroe's Instruments of the Middle Ages and Renaissance. Her next encounter was at the High School of Music and Art in her hometown of New York City, where her music survey teacher began the year with a study and comparison of East African chant and Gregorian chant. And she went on to Vassar College, where several of her professors were scholars in the field of historical musicology. And she also sang in the Vassar Choir, where she was introduced to Grace Feldman playing the viol in Bach's St. Matthew Passion, and she began viol lessons with Grace. So, with her mind set on this concentration in early music, Pat went on to the graduate program in historical performance at Sarah Lawrence College, and she's studying the viol with Judith Davidoff. That recording that she got as a Christmas gift came from a Black family, and her music survey teacher in high school was a Black composer. So when she arrived at Vassar, she already felt empowered to follow her dream, and her professors totally supported her. And it was only as a professional musician that she began to see that her interest in early music was being challenged by her race, and she realized that she wasn't being taken seriously due to the usual stereotypes until she began working and touring with the medieval ensemble Sequentia, based in Germany. So Pat vowed that when she returned to the US, she was going to make sure that people who looked like her had an equal chance to follow their dreams if classical music became a serious interest. She was the director of Foundation Relations for the Sphinx organization, which is an advocacy organization for Black and Latino classically trained instrumentalists. And while there, she created a full tuition scholarship for a Sphinx competition laureate to attend Mannes College of Music, where she worked for 13 years teaching medieval music. She also worked at the Harlem School of the Arts as senior director of programs, and she was on the faculty of the Brearley School for 22 years. That's a private school in New York that welcomed a diverse community of families and supported a robust music department. She continues her work in diversity awareness as a member of the board of EMA, that's Early Music America, and chair of their Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Awareness Task Force. And of course, she's a member of the board of the Viola da Gamba Society, where she's chair of the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee. So please welcome Pat, and turn up your sound and listen to this wonderful lecture. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Roz. And I would also like to thank the VDGSA and Roz and Lisa and John and everyone who's been supportive of me giving this presentation tonight. I also want to acknowledge that I had some great support from Judith Davidoff and Larry Lipnick and someone named Kim Taylor Thompson, who you will hear about in this presentation. So I'm just going to mention that we're going to look at diversity in 3 segments. One is a review of the history of the civil rights movement in the 60s and its personal effects on me. And then we'll go to see why the movement failed in the arts. And then we'll go on to see ways in which in our own field we can do more research and gain more knowledge through visual art. So I'm going to share the, share the screen. And here we go. In the 1960s, some 100 years after the Civil War, we became reacquainted with the struggle for civil rights for the Negro or colored race. Sometime in the early 70s, the Equal Opportunity Movement opened the doors for Blacks or African Americans to realize the American dream. At the turn of the 21st century, we began discussions and widened our outreach in supporting people of color with strategically planned diversity initiatives. Today, we recognize that there are more marginalized people in our society, including more ethnicities, more people who are choosing a gender with which to identify, and more people who practice one of many religions. And today, we have circled back to the term Black to emphasize the struggle of which we are presently entrenched, making Black lives matter. We've also added the word inclusion in our vocabulary to emphasize that it is not just enough to award freedoms. We must also engage and work collectively to ensure that everyone's civil rights can be exercised without dispute. I'm going to stop just a second and remove my thumbnails. Okay, great. What is the Oxford Dictionary definition of inclusion? The act or state of including or being included within a group or structure, or a body or particle recognizably distinct from the substance in which it is embedded. We need to be very careful when applying this term to diversity work. Inclusion is not just a gesture of recognition or a body particle distinct in a substance. The definition of inclusion should refer to an environment where viewpoints are considered and backgrounds and perspectives are embraced. And as a result, individuals are valued for their differences, and collectively, we become a much richer people. This is the ultimate goal to which we should aspire. My father told me that I would be the beneficiary of the successful outcome of the civil rights era. So, with an interest in music, I had determined that artists were valued for their creativity and that the arts was colorblind. And it was evident in the high school I attended in New York City called the High School of Music and Art, today called LaGuardia School of the Arts. The school represented the true demographic of the city, and all of us have said that this was a community that was almost void of racial discrimination. It is where I had my first encounter with early music through my African American music survey teacher, William Fisher. William Fisher is a jazz composer who had us comparing, as Roz said earlier, East African chant with Gregorian chant, and who told us that his inspiration was the composer Guillaume de Machaut. He treated us to a complete analysis of his favorite piece of Machaut's, Ma fin et mon commencement. He was an oboe player, and he told us that he enjoyed going to New Orleans in the summer to play in a Baroque-style orchestra, which at that time meant that he played modern oboe and dressed up in costume and a powdered wig. He also treated the entire school to a work he had just completed entitled Concerto Grosso in D Blues for the Herbie Mann Jazz Quartet. That was my first introduction to the Concerto Grosso style, not that of Corelli or Handel. And if you look at the physical characteristics of Corelli and Handel, and then look again at Bill Fisher, somehow I can see that he may have channeled Corelli and Handel as well as Machaut. I learned a great deal growing up during the civil rights movement, and in the mid-60s, every facet of American life was touched by it. It was a very vocal and many times violent and complex struggle. Civil rights activists came from every sphere and included well-known personalities, politicos, actors, and artists who were quite sincere in lending their voices to the cause. I didn't know it at the time, but I was very lucky to live in the same building as the jazz icon, Dr. Billy Taylor, and his family. Riverton was a very special community in Harlem, which was known as a center of cultural and major political activity, and it was easy to be influenced by those we knew, those who would go on to become historical figures for our generation and beyond. We admired and wanted to emulate those who came before us, as you cannot impact history unless you know your history. Dr. Taylor was one of the personalities that not only influenced my decision to become a musician, but also a committed civil rights activist who contributed what he could to the movement with his composition, I Wish I Knew How It Feels to Be Free. It was his daughter, Kim Taylor Thompson, who was the influence for a composition which became one of the anthems for the civil rights movement in the 60s. I recently touched base with Kim, who was able to tell me about her father's composition. I didn't actually encourage him to compose it. I apparently inspired it, she says. I came home from school singing a Negro spiritual that I had learned in school, and I was singing it all wrong, apparently. My dad tried to correct me and to explain the song, but I insisted that I was doing it right because I was singing it the way the nuns had taught me. I was actually insisting that the white Catholic nuns knew more about Negro spirituals than my dad. I was 7 years old, though. But that interaction with me inspired him to sit down and write I Wish I Knew How It Would Feel to Be Free, and he wrote it in about 15 minutes. Dr. Martin Luther King loved the song. Dr. King was a huge jazz fan, but he could never remember the name of the piece. It does have a long title. So he would say to my dad, play that churchy piece. And Dad would know to play I Wish I Knew. And here is a photograph of Berry Gordy, who had not yet started the Motown label. Martin Luther King, Lena Horne, and Dr. Billy Taylor. And I think this is right before the March on Washington. As a result of the commitment of so many, with efforts made to carefully position our country as a model for democracy, we began to believe in a future where freedom and equality for all would finally exist. The March on Washington in 1963 brought activists from every field to the Lincoln Memorial, and we'll see here some notables. Charlton Heston, a political activist and supporter of civil rights and a Democrat at the time. For those who were too young to remember, Charlton Heston was Ben-Hur in a late 1950s movie. He was a very well-known actor. But his political persuasion shifted in 1972 to a more conservative point of view, which included his support of the National Rifle Association and opposition to affirmative action, which he considered reverse discrimination. Here's Harry Belafonte, who is still active in his 90s and recently gave a stunning and moving performance in a retrospective of the civil rights movement in the movie Black Klansman. The author and a social critic, James Baldwin, the complex actor, Marlon Brando, and in the back here, a Kennedy in-law and actor, Peter Lawford. And of course, we must not forget the debut of a young civil rights activist who would go on to make his mark in history, a 23-year-old John Lewis, who addressed the multitudes at the Lincoln Memorial that day. Brando's commitment to civil rights provided many an opportunity for him to meet one-on-one with Martin Luther King. However, Brando apparently enjoyed playing the recorder. And the caption on this photograph says, "Musical Marlon tootles on a recorder, an archaic kind of wooden flute. He also performs on it through his nose, his specialty being the chic of Araby. A good drum player, Marlon goes in for weird effects on tom-toms and voodoo drums. He is engaged to a South American girl who likes drums too." I want to thank Larry Lipnick for this photo and another one coming up shortly. Marvin Gaye also lent his voice literally to the movement, recording songs that express the pain of the struggle and the need for all of us to work together for the cause. Jacob Barnhill's master's thesis entitled Marvin Gaye's What's Going On and the Civil Rights Movement, A History and Analysis, introduces Gaye and this particular ballad he wrote as another symbol of the struggle. He says, "Soul singer Marvin Gaye was an important voice for the African American community and the civil rights movement. His talents as a musician and composer helped Gaye achieve national recognition, which caused his powerful lyrics to reach a diverse audience across the country. With a passionate voice, Gaye sang songs with messages of love, peace, and understanding. More importantly, however, Gaye touched on many issues plaguing American society in the late 1960s, including the unjust treatment of African Americans, race riots, the Vietnam War, and poverty, among many others. The music propelled the lyrics even further with memorable melodies, genre fusion, and appeal to a wide audience. The music itself helped define the sound of African American culture, drawing on influences from predominantly African American genres." Well, Marvin Gaye seems too to have had an interest in the recorder. My goodness. Could you imagine Marvin Gaye, Marlon Brando, and Noah Greenberg working in support of the civil rights movement and early music? One of the bold moves in New York City in the mid-60s, at the time in the field of classical music, was the creation of the first fully integrated orchestra called the Symphony of the New World. The Symphony of the New World not only created an opportunity for African American professional musicians, but also gave the African American audience, especially youth, an opportunity to see people who looked like themselves on stage playing together with other white professionals. The orchestra boasted a roster of 36 Black musicians and 52 white musicians. It had the backing of sponsors, which included Copeland, Barber, Menotti, and Leonard Bernstein. It also had the backing of notable artists, our actors Ossie Davis and Ruby Dee, and their children, who were always accompanying them on civil rights protests, and then also the Harlem Renaissance writer Langston Hughes. Dee and Davis made sure their children were actively involved in civil rights protests. Nora Davis, seen here next to her father, continued her activism when she was a sophomore at Vassar College in the fall of 1969. She became a member of the infamous contingent of African American women who took over the school to demand the creation of an Africana Studies program. And as chronicled by Dr. Claudia Lynn Thomas, class of 71, we learned that the actor Ossie Davis had directed his secretary to call our parents to console them and let them know we were all right. His daughter, a sophomore, was one of us, one of the 34 who occupied Main Building. A few days after we relinquished Main Building, Ossie Davis visited the campus, and in his resounding voice, he began, "As a parent of a student here," he went on to say that he applauded the Black students' passion for effecting change, and he encouraged the college to honor its commitment. Nora says that words that were important to her were told to her by Martin Luther King directly. He asked that she consider herself an activist all the time. Don't be seduced by a post-racial society. We haven't yet reached the goal. And I have to say that I am thankful and owe these women a great deal for paving the way for me to enter an historically elite white environment and thrive and find my passion, because this is where I discovered my love for early music and the viola da gamba. Among the founding musicians of the Orchestra of the New World was an African-American timpanist named Frederick King. King was a Juilliard alum who played in a number of ensembles, and among those ensembles was the New York Pro Musica. Noah Greenberg, founder of the Pro Musica in the early 50s, was also a political activist and a member of the American Socialist Workers' Party. He joined at a time when socialism was equated with communism in this country, and when one feared they may become a target for Joseph McCarthy. Once he became entrenched in early music and director of the Pro Musica, Greenberg officially abandoned his formal alliance with socialist politics, but never abandoned its ideology. He truly believed that opportunity should be extended to everyone, despite ethnicity, and made it his duty to hire musicians of color at a time when institutional racism was the norm in American classical music. Frederick King began engagements with the Pro Musica starting in 1963. Here is a picture of one of their concerts, and there's Frederick King in the back, Noah Greenberg, there's Judith Davidoff, Lanu Davenport, Martha Bixler, Ed Smith, and I can't really identify these others. It's a little too fuzzy. And here's a close-up so you can see Frederick, Noah, Judith. I recently, went too fast. I recently spoke with Judith Davidoff, who remembers King on their famous tour to the Soviet Union in the mid-60s. She explained that he often performed with the ensemble in its larger configuration, and this tour was one of those opportunities. They traveled to all the cosmopolitan cities at that time, and near the end of their tour, they went to Tbilisi in the southern part of the country. What she remembers is that the town was charming, and the main street on which their hotel was situated was near a very large outdoor vegetable and fruit market. Judith and Frederick decided to tour the market on a warm and sunny day, and at some point Judith found herself alone, turned to look for Frederick, and found him surrounded by a very large group of Russians who had formed a large circle around him and proceeded to stare at him in silence. She said they had never seen anything like him before. With tension still brewing between the free world and the world behind the Iron Curtain, as we called it in those days, these exchanges were less embarrassing, but more they made us proud as they exemplified the spirit of America and was an example of free society at work, albeit with this one Black musician. Greenberg took his political viewpoints and interest in civil rights very seriously. In 1963, he met with James Meredith, the first Black student to attend the University of Mississippi. And in 1965, Musica sponsored a benefit in Greenville, South Carolina, in support of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. When Noah Greenberg died in 1966, and the Musica disbanded in 1974, the civil rights movement had made significant strides, it believed, and was now looking back at all that had been accomplished. I wanted to mention also that the singer, baritone Marvin Hayes, was also someone who worked with the Musica and appeared in the play of Herod. I was able to obtain a program from the estate of a friend of mine's mother, and was so excited to be able to look at the people that I could recognize from my early days as an interested early music and a devotee of early music. And so I see that Frederick King was in the production, as well as I mentioned Marvin Hayes as the armiger. And then we had Ray Duvall, Paul Maynard, Jan DeGaetani, Elizabeth Humes, Lanu Davenport, Judith Davidoff, Shelley Gruskin, Arthur Burroughs, Robert Kuhn, Brayton Lewis. And those were the names of people that I remember as being important early music artists. When I gave this presentation last year, I ended this section with the question, so what is it today that brings us in our field back to the discussion of embracing the differences and supporting inclusion when the general consensus has been that we have made great progress on a global scale? We now all know too well why we are back here and why we are discussing the issue as if it never existed. It managed to be conveniently shoved under the rug. We never successfully achieved a level playing field in our efforts, and that is especially true in the field of historical performance. Greenberg's contribution to those achievements to diversify the music industry was never sustained or maintained after his death and the end of the ensemble. And the usual ego and bureaucratic unrest within the orchestra got in the way of this initiative continuing. However, at the time, we were considered to be living in a post-racial society, which simply meant the movement was believed to be progressing on its own steam. Globally, we set protocol and passed laws, but did little to manage the work or change a person's thinking. Those who were quick to say they are not racist or who believe they have made conscious efforts to be inclusive, may find that the response to that perception and the efforts are not what they expected, especially given recent events. Our attempts to create strategies to address diversity can backfire because the language we use needs to be carefully crafted. People of color are still considered to be underprivileged or marginalized. As we begin to define society more by socioeconomic terms, we can no longer justify those assumptions. When planning a diversity initiative, the goal still seems to be to give the gift of assimilation. And this strips the dignity away from individuals who don't quite feel comfortable being expected to change behavior in order to gain privilege and acceptance. Peggy McIntosh, Associate Director of the Wellesley College Center for Research on Women and founder of the National Seed Project, seeking educational equity and diversity, and a former member of the history faculty at the Brearley School in New York in the late 50s, created the term white privilege. In fact, she taught a course at the all-female school on white privilege and male privilege in the late 50s. McIntosh said, as a white person, I realized I had been taught about racism as something that puts others at a disadvantage, but had been taught not to see one of its corollary aspects, white privilege, which puts me at an advantage. I think whites are carefully taught not to recognize white privilege, as males are taught not to recognize male privilege. My schooling followed the pattern my colleague Elizabeth Minich has pointed out. Whites are taught to think of their lives as morally neutral, normative, and average, and also ideal, so that when we work to benefit others, this is seen as work that will allow them to be more like us. The book White Fragility has become a bestseller, but has also come under criticism for being condescending and dehumanizing to Black people, almost an emotional lobotomy. That is because DiAngelo's thesis has been interpreted as one where white people have to tread very lightly when interacting with Black people, or they may be called racist. It reminds me of the trajectory of another controversial bestseller, The Bible of the Counterculture of the late 60s, Charles Reich's The Greening of America. His thesis was a radical philosophy about rejecting the status quo for a fantasy life. Its message and popularity quickly fizzled, and I only hope that DiAngelo's book does not suffer the same fate. She does not mince words, and she really sets in motion a discussion that makes all of us think, if we allow, about what we hold inside ourselves as truths instead of being on the defensive and in denial. She makes us think on a deeper and more substantial level about the definition of inclusion, and I urge everyone to put aside the critics and explore it. DiAngelo believes that the nomenclature we have associated with the discussion of race evolved over the years in an attempt to keep the conversation fresh and people engaged as we continue to struggle with creating methods to deal effectively with the issue of race relations. She says, white fragility is a state in which even a minimum amount of racial stress becomes intolerable to white people, triggering a range of defensive moves. And these moves include the outward display of emotions such as anger, fear, and guilt, and behaviors such as argumentation, silence, and leaving the stress-inducing situation. These behaviors, in turn, function to reinstate white racial equilibrium. Now, as a person of color, I can't count the number of times I've expressed concern about a way I was treated by a colleague, only to have someone cut me off and say, "Oh no, she couldn't have possibly meant that. You misinterpreted the intentions." But that kind of remark, instead of helping the situation, can be interpreted by me as my lacking the keen sense to determine the subtleties of personality. We now hear the words white privilege, white fragility, performative, and others so much and at times misdefined. But the fact is that these words are in our vocabulary in this round and are inspiring a conversation that is long overdue. I created a term called a circle of fifths to describe the perpetual behavior we exhibit time after time in diversity work. The desire for equality leads to a struggle for civil rights, from which the result is the institution of equal opportunity, with the initiative to create a more diverse society, which is considered successful if it results in a high rate of assimilation. White privilege thinking perpetuates that fifth behavior, and it limits progress. As long as the privilege is extended and appears to be embraced by all, we neglect to manage whether it is efficacious and meaningful to those who are the recipients. Instead, we need to substitute the word inclusion in element 5, and we need to clearly define what that means. White fragility puts us all on an equal playing field. It forces us to look and feel the pain that comes with addressing the uncomfortable. In our field of historical performance, it is not enough to recruit or encourage people of color to join our programs. There are ways in which to extend an invitation that can be considered genuine and inclusive without being patronizing. People of color need to see more people of color being engaged in what we do. There are only a few instances or examples of this. One was the opportunity to deliver this paper along with some other musicologists and concerned citizens at the HP conference at Indiana, where this topic was given attention and papers were presented from several perspectives. The other is engaging more people in leadership positions who can add value. And this is presently occurring in the Viola da Gamba Society of America. Educational programs are bringing a more diverse youth into the fold. And when I joined the board in the 80s, I was the only person of color. I am once again on the board, which is very diverse in its makeup, including now 4 people of color. When I joined the EMA board in 1996, I was the only person of color. The EMA board presently has just one person of color right now, which is me again, but we will be having another one join us, Reggie Mobley, in January of 2021, and we are searching for more leadership in the African American community and in other ethnicities as well. This is a start, but it is a late start in the process to be publicizing statements of solidarity with Black Lives Matter with intentions and plans on the drawing board. Due to recent unfortunate circumstances and one of the main downsides of social media, the word is that our field is racist. We have a great deal of thinking to do. Is early music racist, or is it just exclusive? As scholar performers, we have spent more time validating European music and ignoring the music of non-white cultures. We work with the tools we have and the information that is placed in front of us. We spend an enormous amount of time observing. We observe visual art to learn more about the construction of instruments. We read extracts and primary sources to glean information on performance practice. Let's make history. Let's find ways to broaden the spectrum of our study to search for and document the appearance of people of color during the periods in which we focus. Let's stop calling early music from Asia crossover repertoire. Let's search for extracts that may include personal and/or documented history of persons of color. There is more research and evidence of people of color living, thriving, and flourishing in the Middle Ages, Renaissance, and Baroque periods, and beyond. Black musicians and entertainers have been employed by the courts since at least 1194. Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI, in the latter half of the 12th century, was accompanied by Black trumpeters on his entry into Sicily. A Black slave named Martino was purchased in 1470 to be the trumpeter on board an Italian royal ship. Henry VII and Henry VIII of England employed John Blank, a Black trumpet player. Elizabeth I had at her court a, quote, little black Moor, unquote, a boy in her service, as well as Anthony Vause, a Black trumpeter who was employed at the Tower of London in 1618. A Moorish drummer was employed at the court of James IV of Scotland in 1505. Teodosio I, Duke of Bragança, Portugal, had 10 Black musicians who played the charamela. Among a list of gallery slaves, in 1555 belonging to Cosimo de' Medici I was a Moro Negro described as a trumpeter. In 1713, Frederick William I, later King of Prussia, asked for several black boys between the age of 13 and 15, all well-shaped, to be trained as musicians for his military. Musicologist Arne Spohr has been researching black wind players who were employed in civic bands in Germany. Let's look at some examples of visual art. The Cantigas de Sancta Maria from the 13th century have provided images of both Christians and Muslims playing together, and we have the scholarly resources that discuss the influences of Eastern music on Western music in the Middle Ages. When you look at an image from the Cantigas, you can choose to study this one, and you can study this one, which shows a Muslim and Christian playing together. We are grateful to the Flemish School for visual images that provide acute details of instruments, such as this triptych by Hans Memling. This painting of angels playing various instruments is an incredible example of detail, dimension, and also playing technique. Here's a depiction. I couldn't find another painting with any people of color playing string instruments, but I do have a Memling-inspired photo of a production I did with Sequencia, and you can see me playing a Memling-inspired viol, Ben Bagby playing a Memling-inspired harp, and Stephen Grant and Eric Menzel playing Memling-inspired portative organs. Here's a depiction of wind players, and it's a detail of a painting of the coronation of Pius III in 1503 in Siena, Italy. And here is a detail of the engagement of Saint Ursula and Prince Aetherius, painted in 1520 in Portugal by the master of Saint Auta. Here we have a band of black shawm and sackbut players. Miranda Kaufman's book, Black Tudors, traces the lives of 10 Africans who settled in Tudor England. These are the trade routes that have been documented of Africans and Blacks from Africa and also from the Caribbean on their way to Western Europe. They arrived on ships that traveled the trade routes from North Africa and the sub-Saharan coasts of West Africa and the Spanish Caribbean. Many ended up as slaves and servants in Italy, Spain, and Portugal, and some made their way to England on trade ships going north. Those who did make it to England landed as free people, and among those was John Blank, who became Henry VII's and Henry VIII's royal trumpeter. He is believed to have hailed from North or West Africa, and given that he most often wore a turban, we believe he may have been a follower of Islam. Blank earned a respectable living in royal service and even requested a raise at one point, which was granted by Henry VIII. In 1511, Henry VIII decided to celebrate the birth of his son with Catherine of Aragon with a tournament at Westminster. And at that tournament, John Blank was one of the trumpeters. Here he is in his turban. And here he is in another close-up of a tapestry at the Westminster tournament. When Blank married an Englishwoman, he had a church ceremony, and Henry VIII paid for his wedding outfit. Imagine he married a native of England in a church ceremony, even though he was thought to be a Muslim. Here is assimilation at work. Jacques Francis, a black slave owned by an Italian trader who is chronicled in Miranda Kaufman's book, also has an interesting story. While on an extended trip to England in 1584, he witnessed the sinking of Henry VIII's ship, the Mary Rose. Attempts to try to raise the ship were unsuccessful, and not many of the crew were able to swim or dive. Jacques was offered up by his master to join a diving crew to retrieve the valuable weapons of war that had sunk with the ship. It is believed that the diving crew were all black Caribbeans who were adept at the art. And I'm just imagining that they swam past the collection of instruments that sunk with the ship, which among them were 2 fiddles and a bow, a shawm, 3 three-hole pipes, and a tabor drum. Now, in 1977, the instruments were, whatever fragments were left, were retrieved. And it is believed that this is the top of a vielle and bow. And at some point on social media, there was an argument that ensued between someone, I don't remember his name, who says this can't possibly be an instrument because it's not clear to play an instrument without bouts. I don't know what to believe, but I'm going to keep the dream alive that this is actually what it is. But just to cover myself if someone should have also heard that rumor. The life of Sir Henry Umpton. We know of Sir Henry Umpton's funeral through Dowland's Lacrimé collection. Here's a depiction of not only his death, but various events in his life. It's an anonymous painting, which was commissioned posthumously as a commemoration by his wife. He's surrounded by scenes from his life and death, and on one detail, the painting shows a broken consort accompanying a group of dancers celebrating the marriage of Unton and his wife Dorothy in 1572. They were entertained by the mask of Mercury and Diana, and in this mask, small childlike Cupid figures in both black and white are dancing in the production. So there are the Cupid figures, the white Cupid figure, the black Cupid figure, the white Cupid figure, the black Cupid figure. Using black figures in the mask represented a trend that was popular. It was popular to have in your domain black servants or black labor working for you. And of course, everyone who landed, as I mentioned, on England were free, but they did have to work. But they were exploited in many different ways to show how wealthy the noble person's family was. Here's Lazarus and Dives. And this painting lies in the Venice Accademia. It's a depiction of the New Testament parable of the rich man who refused succor to the beggar Lazarus, whose sores were licked by a dog. The subject of the painting, in theory, is a criticism of the rich for lavishing themselves with wealth instead of dedicating their wealth to uplift the poor, an important issue in Venice at that time. But I don't know. Take a look at the musicians playing and the little black servant holding the book of music. Certainly, it would have been great if in Italy they had followed the same principle as England. Imaginary Renaissance Palace by the Dutch painter Hendrik Eerts dates from 1602 and sits in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. Here we have a painting that depicts a palace with a banquet with musicians and dancers. If you look at the lower right-hand corner, you'll see a musician playing the lute and Cupid. That musician happens to be a black lute player. Agnolo Bronzino was a court artist for the Medici family, and he was responsible for painting portraits of Cosimo and his family. Here's a series of portraits of the Medici men, and notice the lower right-hand corner portrait of Alessandro de' Medici. Alessandro is believed to be the illegitimate son of Lorenzo de' Medici, Duke of Urbino, but it is also rumored that Lorenzo's cousin, Giulio, later Pope Clement VII, may have been the actual father, alleged to have had an affair with a domestic servant in their home, Simonetta de Colovecchio, who hailed from North Africa. Alexander or Alessandro's African heritage is rarely, if ever, mentioned. He wielded great power as the first Duke of Florence. His mother made sure he was educated and had status. He became a patron of some of the leading artists of the era. And he also had two illegitimate daughters with two different women. And I'm actually trying to follow their trajectory to see where they ended up. But it's a cover-up that has been going on for many, many years. The Postillon. This is a painting which an anonymous artist, a painting from 1730, which lies in the National Trust. A postilion rides at the head of a carriage of a lord's traveling party, and this particular gentleman, named John Hanby, age 25, is considered to be a domestic servant and coach boy to a nobleman named John Mellor. He played the natural horn and appears to have had a brother who also played, with whom he did not enjoy a good relationship. After Hanby's death, the painter added a posthumous inscription. Of the condition of this negra, our information is but meager. However, here he was a dweller, and drew the horn for Master Mellor. Here too he died, but when or how can scarcely be remembered now, but that to Marchville he was sent, and had a good Christian interment. Pray heaven may stand his present friend where black or white distinctions end, for sure on this side of the grave they are too strong twixt lord and slave. Here also lived a dingy brother who played together with the other, but of him yet longer rotten, every particular's forgotten, save that like Tweedle, Tum, and Dee, these but in notes could near agree, and all things else, as they do tell ye, we're just like Handel and Corelli. Oh, had it been in their life's course to have met with Massa Wilberforce, they wouldn't this alone have joined, and been together of a mind, have raised their horns to one high tune, and blown his merits to the moon. Wilberforce was a politician at the time that advocated the abolition of slavery. Here are four female musicians by Luca Giordano from Italy, which lies in the Rijksmuseum. And here we have two singers, women singers, a woman lute player, and a black woman wind player. Either, I think she's playing a mute cornet. Arnie Spohr has been researching Black musicians in Germany, as I mentioned. And he highlights in his paper, Moor und Trumpeter, what we know about two Black trumpet players, Christian Real and Christian Gottlieb. They both enjoyed lucrative careers and were paid trumpet players in the military. As long as they remained in the confines of the court or their noble employers, they were safe. Despite their membership in the music guild, they were referred to as Mohren, black servants, with low ranking, as opposed to their white counterparts, who had professional titles of trumpeter and pauker. On the left here, we have a Black kettle drummer who is in the pageant staged for the wedding of Duke Karl Eugen of Württemberg and Prince Elizabeth Frederick Sophie of Brandenburg Bayreuth in Stuttgart, and this dates from 1748. In the center here, we have Christian Real, actually in the center, although I can't tell if he's a Black musician. They all look alike, unfortunately, in this etching. Christian Real, according to Arnie Spohr, in the center, is in the middle of this procession, a funeral procession for Duke Eberhard III, and this dates from 1674, a detail from an engraving. The coat of arms on the right is the coat of arms of Christian Gottlieb, and this was given to him when he was baptized. It was given to him by Colonel Bertram Rantzau, who probably sponsored his baptism. He ended up having several noble godparents and witnesses to this baptism. And as a member of one of the oldest and most influential noble families in Schleswig-Holstein, Rantzau provided him with a coat of arms. This was an indication that he was free and held a privileged position in society, and this was a rare status for any musician in Germany. Rantzau also provided him with a significant trust fund, which Gottlieb put toward real estate, and he ended up owning 2 farms. Joseph Bologna, or Le Chevalier de Saint-Georges, is someone that we all should know. This painting by Mather Brown, dating 1787, indicates that Bologna was a master fencer, but he's also an incredible violinist, a composer, and taught Marie Antoinette. Beethoven had a very close friendship with the violinist George Bridgetower. Bridgetower was one of the most talented violin soloists in Europe, and he was a child prodigy, that's him over here, who toured England and France, giving concerts at the age of 11, and he would become known as the African Prince in London. He was born to a father of West Indian heritage and a mother of German heritage. He was later elected to the Royal Society of Musicians and attained a degree from Trinity Hall, Cambridge. Beethoven dedicated one of his sonatas to him, and he dedicated it with Mulatto Sonata, composed for the Mulatto Bridgetower, a great fool and mulatto composer. But unfortunately, this dedication was rescinded, never assigned to the work, as Bridgetower fell out of favor with Beethoven after disparaging a close friend of his. And the sonata was then dedicated to Rodolphe Kreutzer, a renowned violinist in France, and is now known as the Kreutzer Sonata. Queen Charlotte, Sophia Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, was the wife of King George III. She was known to be a patron of the arts. She supported Johann Christian Bach, who was her music teacher, met the 8-year-old Mozart and asked that he dedicate his Opus 3 to her in 1764, and invited Haydn to stay at Windsor on his visit in 1794. Queen Charlotte's background suggests that she is related to Black relatives of the Portuguese royal family of Margarita de Castro e Souza, a 15th century Portuguese noblewoman 9 generations removed. This means that Queen Charlotte is the grandmother of Queen Victoria. When a Buckingham Palace spokesman was once asked about this claim, the response was, "This has been rumored for years and years. It is a matter of history, and frankly, we've got more important things to talk about." Well, last year I was able to highlight the Duchess of Sussex, Meghan Markle, and her interest in contributing to the arts and various charities. We all know that within just a few years, the British press chose a publicity campaign with degradation and humiliation as its mission, and we no longer have that opportunity to watch her grow as a royal in the royal family. It's also clear to note that even though she's Black, even though she's a commoner, it is also almost more egregious that she's a commoner of color being associated with royal lineage. But for however short was her reign, Meghan certainly left an undeniable and documented history that cannot be challenged. As you may remember, at their wedding, the couple invited a gospel choir to sing, a Black minister to preach, and the first Black winner of the BBC Young Musician competition, cellist Sheku Kane Mason, to perform. We can only imagine what she may have accomplished and first she may have achieved as a member of the royal family, but her work as a commoner in this country, or I should say as a citizen in this country, will be cherished just as much and will help contribute to our history as a country. In the meantime, diversity and inclusion starts again with changing the language with which we speak, think, and act. We can't bring diversity into our field successfully unless we come up with a plan that encourages us to take a sometimes painful look at ourselves on both sides, receptive to being educated, seeking answers to questions about our heritage, and learning more about what distinguishes each of us from each other, and therefore establishing each of us as valuable contributors. These are the seeds that help us grow and embrace the very thing that brings us all together here this week and grants us the privilege to share this with so many more. You must also study and learn the lessons of history, because humanity has been involved in this soul-wrenching existential struggle for a very long time. People on every continent have stood in your shoes through decades and centuries before you. The truth does not change, and that is why the answers worked out long ago can help you find solutions to the challenges of our times. Continue to build union between movements stretching across the globe, because we must put away our willingness to profit from the exploitation of others. Though I may not be here with you, I urge you to answer the highest calling of your heart and stand up for what you truly believe. In my life, I have done all I can to demonstrate that the way of peace, the way of love and nonviolence is the more excellent way. Now it is your turn to let freedom ring. The end. And again, I want to acknowledge Larry Lipnick for the photos of Marlon Brando and Marvin Gaye. I want to thank Judith Davidoff for her Pro Musica memories. And I also want to thank, which I didn't in the beginning, thanks to Dana Marsh and Indiana University for inviting me to create and present this ongoing discovery. I'm going to stop my share.
Pat, that was wonderful. Thank you so much. And, you know, it's even, everybody knows that in the present climate here, it's even more crucial for us to be discussing these issues, finding the right language to communicate with each other. And this was incredibly informative and helpful. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure.
And, I know you gave this talk last year in Indiana, and obviously with these recent events, you've updated it. And I guess that was what encouraged you to do so. But when you go back and look for things historical, how are you finding your sources? Like, where are you digging for more and more images and information?
Well, now we have primary sources. I just quoted from John Lewis's op-ed, and that was just yesterday. So, my ears are always peaked for the latest and greatest news, which changes every single day. So I'm always on call to be sensitive to that. I've also just been using my resources to, if I have an interest in something, to look for more sources, academic sources. And I just came across this collection. I don't think you can see it because of the glare. A collection of blacks in Western art, which was put out by Henry Louis Gates. It's a whole series. I think there are 7 volumes of them. And I just got the volume on the Age of Discovery, which is the age of the Renaissance and Baroque. And it doesn't necessarily have anything new for me in terms of musicians who are Black, but what it does do, it chronicles what the Black experience was like. And the text is also very scholarly. And I think with that combination of things, we can start to move forward and feel as if we have a basis for setting examples in our own world of early music. There are scholars who I have stumbled upon. I know there's one who is doing, who carries a lecture on John Blank. He's been carrying that lecture around England and the United States. And just recently, this was posted in EMA, there is a professor, French horn player, who has done also her research on Black wind players. And as you can see, most of the players, all of the players, except for that one example of a lute player, were all wind players, because that was how you could get a job. In the home, I'm sure that the servants heard people playing viol consorts. So my feeling is, even if they weren't learning to play the instrument, they understood the genre, and they may have had a passion for listening to it, but would never get their hands on an instrument, or we would never hear about that.
Right. And, that another interesting corollary to that is that recorders and wind instruments are a lot less expensive, even for today's players, than viols and violins.
Well, I think it was probably the social aspect of it. The wind instruments were used to present the noble person.
Right, and the stringed instruments were in the private music.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Exactly.
So that was one thing. Mm-hmm.
So here's a question from Sarah Mead. She wants to know more about Blank. She says, at what age did Blank come to England? And she's wondering how he learned to play the trumpet and how he became inducted into the Trumpets Guild when so many trumpeters followed in their father's footsteps.
Well, in England, I mean, I don't know about his background other than he landed on the shores. I haven't gone back to reread Miranda Kaufman's book, but she has a whole chapter on him. The point being, he may have been engaged at the court in some other capacity and then been tapped by someone to learn to play the trumpet and had that skill.
Right.
And he lived in that Tudor community that she talks about.
Do we know anything about whether he had children who went on in music, and do we know anything about his descendants?
No, we don't. I don't. She doesn't reveal whether he had children. We know he got married, but that's something I should actually take a look at and see if she has any further research on it.
Yeah, and Sarah also asks, what is known about how Black children like these were educated and what became of them when they were grown?
You mean the children who were in as servants in the home? Um, I haven't really had a chance to research that because I'm researching musicians. But like I mean, I can I can tell you about my experience with my own parents when I asked them who were the slaves in our family. And there's a distinction between the house slave and the field slave, and they had an argument that went on beyond my comprehension. But what I understood is that as a house slave, my mother said, so my family learned to read. So I'm sure that if as such there are certain households where this probably happened. I know in Italy with Simonetta Colavecchio, she obviously was cared for in a different way than other domestics or slaves. There was no problem for her to ask for money to help raise Alessandro, and he had a good education.
I'm also think about the wonderful books by Polly Murray, who describe her extensive, she and her sisters, I think, extensive education in North or South Carolina. I can't remember. They're wonderful books. But here's the next question. Have you looked into the Sephardic scene, Muslim, Jewish, Christian influences? Were Black musicians included in this seemingly tolerant environment?
And I haven't, but Ben Bagby gave a lecture at Amherst a few weeks ago, and he touched on Wolkenstein's travels around Europe. And I did ask him that question because I know that he was in Portugal and in Spain, whether he had picked up any of the music of the indigenous natives there who were Sephardic. And he couldn't tell me. He said he probably did. I don't think there's a chronicle about it. And one of the reasons why there isn't, and we have to find more primary sources about it, is because it wasn't as big an issue as it is for us. These people were happy to get out of wherever, Africa or, to be employed. And this was not as if they were living in a separate Black community. So whatever we know about them right now, it really is indicative of what the lifestyle was like at that time.
Right. And a lot of that Southern Spanish society, I think, was pretty assimilated in its way before the expulsion of the Jews. I mean, for those few centuries between Alfonso II and Isabella, Ferdinand and Isabella.
And I think the interesting thing is, if you see one Black person like John Blank in a community, that's exotic. That was considered exotic. So in some cases, we don't really understand what exactly the relationship was socially between someone. If someone's exotic to us, that means they're special and highly, they're someone to revere. So that's something I have to do more research on as well.
Yeah. Now here's a question from Gilbert Ritchie. What are the hallmarks of inclusion versus the hallmarks of assimilation? How can we identify one versus the other?
Well, assimilation is when, let's say, you develop a program and you go into a community and you say, I'm bringing this to you, and this is how it's done. And the people that you bring to show this project are all white. to a school, let's say that's primarily people of children of color, if someone says, I'm interested in learning this, there is a point of time where they're happy to learn, but then they realize that no one else looks like them. And so you think it's successful because you've gotten some people to take you up on that project. But in reality, there has to be another way to do this. And the way to do this is to have people of color going into schools and talking passionately about what they love about playing early music. Because then a younger person can say, oh, well, I'm feeling that passion too, and would feel comfortable going up and talking to someone. Oh, how did you get involved in this? So so assimilation is having a project and getting excited about bringing it to people, but not realizing, you're not asking, well, how do you feel about this? Do you feel comfortable? The other side of inclusion is you see that people of that persuasion are thriving with everyone else in that community, and that is inclusion. And also looking at repertoire. I mean, everyone says, oh, we should do more repertoire of people of color. I mean, it really depends on what you're doing. I mean, if we could find viol consorts written or composed by other ethnicities, I'm sure we would do it. But there are other ways to do that as well, playing modern music by composers as well. So there are many ways to go about it to make this much more inclusive.
Yeah, I think that you might have answered Scott Mason's question here, which says, could Pat comment on the term inclusion with respect to its pros and cons? It seems that it can embrace different cultures and that it can erase the distinctiveness of various cultures.
Well, it depends on, that's what we have to do. We have to define every organization that wants to have a diversity and inclusion committee to work on this. You have to decide how it's customized to who you are serving. If the point is, if we're going to bring viols into the schools, you're not erasing someone's background or heritage. You are enhancing it by increasing the curriculum and education in the curriculum. I mean, it's highly unusual to have a program like that. It's so special. And I know at Brarely, I brought early music to that community, and the Brarely community, believe it or not, is extremely diverse. They have made it part of their mission to bring in Black and other ethnic families, and they all benefit from what they learn in this music program, including early music. So they're seeing themselves right then and there, and they're seeing me offering this to them, and they're gaining the knowledge that they can take with them as they move on.
Right. Let me see. Someone asks, what's the evidence, or can we find out if these immigrant musicians from Africa brought anything of their own cultures into Europe?
That's interesting. When I mentioned that John Blank got married in a church, that did wipe out his Muslim background, but that was his choice. I am sure that anyone who came to a country brought something with them, but whether it was absorbed by the white counterparts, that's something I don't know. I mean, I can see a separation of church and state there, where that's the native form of entertainment, and ours is much more sophisticated.
Mm-hmm. Let me see. So Anne Duranceau asks, have you looked into the Sephardic scene? And were Black musicians included in this seemingly tolerant environment?
As I mentioned, I have not looked at the Sephardic scene. My interest has been in the Renaissance and more Renaissance and early Baroque periods.
Mm-hmm. And then she also asks, are there more and more initiatives like Chichi Nwanoku's orchestra, and do you think we are very far from discrimination disappearing in ensembles and the arts in general?
In the mainstream classical music world, there are initiatives like Chi-Chi's. There's the Sphinx organization, which has its orchestra and 2 quartets. They have a very robust educational program that they institute in the summers at a school, the Walnut School, I think it's in Massachusetts. And there are other festivals, the Gateways Festival, which which will start happening every year now. It draws all of the African American and Hispanic classically trained instrumentalists, and they get together in this convention, just like us, and play music and and orchestral music and chamber music for the entire week. There's the Colors of Music Festival that Lee Pringle oversees in South Carolina, and that's an annual event as well. And I think there's one other one which is a little bit smaller. So there are initiatives in the main classical world. One of the problems I have encountered, and it's not like it's unusual, Sphinx does not recognize early music, and because of that, it's very difficult. It's a wonderful place to try to engage with people and entice them. But I've had a problem, and 2 violinists who are African American, one is African American, one is Hispanic, who went to the convention with the intention of talking to people, found that they had no interest. And so we have to, that's going to be on our plate to try to turn that around, because with their help, we could do something like that with Chi-Chi, like Chi-Chi. And Chi-Chi is also, she bridges that gap. Her orchestra is a modern orchestra, but she's also a period player. So we just need to gain some notoriety, the respect has to grow among this contingent of people.
You know, I'm sure you read the article in the Sunday Times, I don't know, a couple of weeks ago about the decision to end blind auditions for orchestras, and I wonder what your reaction to that was.
Well, I wrote a letter to the editor.
Oh,
of course.
Was it published? Did I miss it?
No. It wasn't published, but I said I found that to be rather a flat, and I didn't agree with the reasoning. The reason you have blind auditions is so that you don't discriminate, and what you need to do is to alter what happens in that process. Once you hear people, you're choosing them for their talent, and then interview them. And that way you can find out just how much they will contribute to an organization. And I likened it to the same principle of the Bollinger versus Gratz decision at the University of Michigan on admissions. And that was, they were taken to task for giving Black people extra points on their college admissions applications. And that was, again, reverse discrimination. What they did do, though, is say, if you can prove in an essay that you are valuable, you're a valuable person who can contribute to the college community, then that sets you apart, and that's something that you can use as an assessment. And I think it's the same here. You know, in early music, we don't have auditions. That's where we fail. You also want to be able to have people that you work with who are good colleagues. And by holding that conversation and putting that element into blind auditions, you may be surprised and find that you have more people of color coming your way. I mean, it's not as if people of color play differently than people who are white.
Yeah. Let me see. We may be coming towards the end of the questions. Aisha asks if there's a proposal to widen the field of early music or historically informed performance to include ethnomusicology. Or no, she changed it for world music, to include world music.
Mm-hmm. What's the question, though?
I'm not quite sure. Well, I guess whether this to widen the field of early music, maybe by encouraging people who play world music instruments to be interested in the repertoire that we play.
Well, I'm not. Yeah, Yeah. I mean, I'm not so sure. I agree with having that. That's asking them to assimilate. But what I do believe in is that we recategorize music. As I said, I was on a panel, an audition panel recently, where someone said, "I am tired of seeing these um, uh, proposals from people who are doing." Uh, what does she call it? Oh God, it's just on the tip of my tongue. But it's music that is sort of folk oriented from another country. And I said, what it is early music from China. Let's just call it that. Um, and I think that that's what we have to do. We have to reestablish what the definition is of early music. It's early music, not in Western Europe. It's early music all over the world. And in that time frame that we work with, there are reasons to bring that in as part of our discussion.
Mm-hmm. Well, I must say, oh gosh, the questions keep on coming, and I mean it's nearly 8:30, and
8:30. It's 9:30.
Sorry, 9:30. 9:30 if you're in the East. But here we'll have our last question. David Ellis asks, would introducing historical concepts of improvisation first be a more effective way to bring students of diverse background into early music?
It could be. I mean, your work. One of the things I believe is that you have to feel comfortable with the people you're around, and improvisation allows you to release those inhibitions, and you get to build a relationship with the people that you're working with, and once you build that relationship, then you don't have to feel the stress of having to behave a certain way to assimilate. You're actually being yourself. So I think that's an excellent way to start. Everyone's on an even playing field because they're all starting. And improvising is a way of learning to speak a language.
Well, I think that's a really excellent place to finish up. And I just want to thank you again so much, because this has been hugely informative and inspiring, and we're so proud that you're chairing the committee for the Viola da Gamba Society Board.
Well, I'm very happy to be able to do this. It's my passion, and as you see, it's going to be a continuing work in progress. I mean, when I've worked with diversity at Manus, I remember the woman who was the rector said, "Diversity work is never finished." So it's an ongoing process.
And we're ready. We're ready to start it with you, Pat. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was fantastic.
Thanks, Pat. And thank you, everybody,
for coming.
What a fine evening. Thank you all.
Okay.
All right.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Oh, she left.
Oh, Oh yeah, should I call her up and say, come back to the Zoom and we
Maybe
can
she's
talk?
tired.
I'll call her up and see.
Roz, you did a fine job with those questions.
Oh, well, you did
Whoa.
thank you so much for feeding them to me like that and keeping them on